Back to the heat. We're talking about the general election in the United Kingdom. Last year, voters in Scotland narrowly decided to stay in the UK after a referendum on independence. But Scottish voters may put that issue back on the agenda when they vote on Thursday. Joining us now from Glasgow is Robin McAlpine, who was a leading activist in the Scottish independence campaign and is now director of the Commonweal, an activist network. Welcome to the show. And we still have Simon Marks with us. Robin, Scottish voters are set to have a major say in what happens in this election. The SNP, the Scottish Nationalist Party, is set to win a large number of seats. How much of a factor will Scotland play in deciding the future of the next British Parliament and, of course, the next leader?
Well, it looks like it's going to be enormous. Scotland only has about, 8, 9, 10% of the seats in Westminster. But what's happened in Scotland is that a range of political factors, key among them the referendum, has meant that Britain's voting system, so we've got a first-past-the-post voting system, and what's happened is that the way that politics has worked out, the SNP has just tipped over the point at which they will dominate the election in Scotland because of that voting system. And some polls are actually predicting that every single of the 59 politicians that Scotland sends to Westminster, it's possible that every one of them would come from the SNP. And because Scotland traditionally elected a lot of Labour people, that difference could become the difference between who becomes Prime Minister in Britain, which is the first time that's ever happened.
Simon, does that make the Scottish Nationalist Party effectively kingmaker?
Well, it has the potential to make them kingmaker. They have slightly been undercut by Ed Miliband, the leader of the Labour Party, who in a televised debate last week insisted that he would do absolutely no deal under any circumstances with the Scottish Nationalists in order to form a coalition government. Do we believe him? We're not sure. We'll find out if the circumstances arise that would actually require him to make that decision. But I think two things are clear. One, the referendum didn't, at the end of the day, settle any kind of question. It is still a very vibrant, very live issue. And I think most people would argue there's a strong possibility that at some point in the next 5, 10, 20 years, we'll see another referendum about Scottish independence. Secondly, this election campaign has thrust a new personality to the forefront of British political life. Nicola Sturgeon of the Scottish National Party has been, in many ways, the star of this election campaign, and that gives you an indication of just what sort of a role the SNP in Scotland, and more broadly than that, has been playing.
And she's not even running for a seat, right?
That's correct. And, she has replaced Alex Salmond, who was the standard bearer for Scottish independence in the referendum, and who many people felt, you either loved him or you hated him. Nicola Sturgeon attracts a very, very different response from members of the public. They were introduced to her, certainly south of the border, in the first leaders' televised debate that took place, and most people argued that, hands down, she won it.
Robin, David Cameron, the current Prime Minister, the Conservative leader, has accused Ms Sturgeon of trying to break up the United Kingdom. Let's listen to what he said about that.
The SNP is a party that doesn't want to come to Westminster to contribute to a government. It wants to come to Westminster to break up our country. And so the prospect
UKIP wants to make us leave the EU, which you don't. So there's potential chaos on either side.
No, but there is a fundamental difference when you have a group of nationalists that want to be involved in the government of a country which they don't want to belong to.
So, Robin, what do you make of that? Is David Cameron right? Does the Scottish Nationalist Party want to simply break up Britain?
Well, I mean, not simply. There's no disguising the fact that it's an independent supporting party. That's what it's about. But, I mean, it's one of those things, the ability to walk and chew at the same time. Everybody in the SNP recognises that they lost the referendum fair and square. So there's no question of another referendum in the next couple of years. And this is real politics. Until there is another referendum, until there's another opportunity for Scotland to make that decision, we're part of the UK. And all of the day-to-day politics that affects Scotland, affect the north of England, affect all of Britain, are still the politics that those politicians are being sent to Westminster to deal with. So what David Cameron is doing is election games. And they're very dangerous election games, because what he seems to be saying is, to the 5 million people in Scotland, you don't really count if you vote for the wrong people. Your voice shouldn't be heard. You shouldn't have any legitimate part of our government. We can legitimately ignore you. And all I can say is that if David Cameron wants to keep the United Kingdom together, he's going about it a very strange way.
But this is the point, isn't it? We are on the eve of potentially the situation at Westminster in that House of Commons that we talked about in the last segment dramatically shifting. You are going to almost certainly have a much larger block of Scottish nationalists in that assembly saying on a consistent day-to-day basis, well, you guys can do whatever you want, but I'm not entirely sure why your votes should impact the situation on our territory. And that takes Britain down a dramatically different political debate, at least legislatively, than it's been having before. Before, those conversations weren't taking place formally in the House of Commons. They may well take place that way after these votes are counted.
And Robin, I'm wondering whether the Scottish Nationalist Party could have an influence on other issues in Scotland as well. For instance, Britain's role in NATO. We know that the SNP wants to cut back on Britain's nuclear submarines, which are based in Scotland right now.
Well, I mean, I think the other thing that we've got to be realistic about here is that while there's a lot of focus on the SNP, what it's really about is a major change in the British electorate. So what Britain has been used to for centuries is most of the time Britain elects one of two big parties who become dominant, who run the show. And I'm afraid the electorate right across Britain has just become disillusioned with what they see as cartel politics. And so I don't believe the people in England are any less disillusioned than the people in Scotland with the way politics have been going. And they're not electing, they're not flocking to one of two big parties and giving them that support. Now, what that means is no matter what the outcome of this, there's going to have to be deals, and some of those deals are going to have to be made between parties that have different views. Now, I think it'll be a cold day in hell before the Houses of Parliament allow the Scottish National Party to not renew the Trident submarine. I think that the Tory party and the Labour Party are so committed to nuclear weapons, they'll just vote together. And so I don't think issues like that are ones that the SNP are likely to be able to influence. But where you've got an issue like, do we keep following this, what in Britain we call the austerity agenda, which is just cutting public services and in effect harming the economy by doing that. It's issues like that where most people in the Labour Party do not really agree with their party's position and would like to see a more a kind of more investment-driven model and less of a cutting-driven model. I think on subjects like that, the SNP are likely to have quite a bit of influence over the direction that Westminster goes. But once again, that reflects the views of an enormous number of people in England, so it's not a Scotland-England issue, it's just about a new kind of politics which isn't being dominated by one big player.
But those defence and foreign policy issues have got to be interrupting the sleep that is enjoyed by American policymakers. You know, the Obama administration has already been putting enormous pressure on the existing government of David Cameron, allied with the Liberal Democrats, to maintain defence expenditure, to stand up and play its role in the battle against Islamic State and in other parts of, other theatres of potential conflict. Any change in that dynamic will only raise further questions in Washington about just how reliable an ally the United Kingdom is going to remain.